A significant proportion of the public is counting down the days and hours left till Donald J. Trump's inauguration. And who can blame them? After 8 years of hope and change, seeing the back of hope and change can't come fast enough. On the other hand, a lot is happening on the leftist camp, and some of its outpouring will be noticed the next day after the inauguration, or at least the oath of office, on January the 21st, with the so-called Women's March, which, as it turns out, it's not exactly a women's march. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, the reason I want to cover this is because this is important for those of us looking at things through the culture war perspective. Now, up until very recently, the cathedral media tried really hard to convince everyone that the culture wars were over and that the left had won. Then Trump happened. With an openly culture war type of campaign, it was proven to those who weren't aware already that the culture wars weren't over at all. It's just that many years conservatives didn't show up. That's why I'm glad to see more and more non-leftists, especially the young ones, showing up to the fight and pushing back. There's a lot of fight going on ahead of us, decades old, and it's going to last much more than many of you dare to expect right now. But the most important step is slowly but surely being made, namely the acknowledgement that the war is going on. And this is already wreaking consequences upon our philosophical opponents, since they didn't expect this to happen to begin with. Basically, more and more people who used to lean heavily on our philosophical opponent's side of things are now suddenly realizing that there's something rotten with that side, which is fantastic. And feminists are the first group to react in an organized fashion to this new reality, well, new for them anyway. And also the first group to feel on its own skin how it feels to be on the wrong side of history. Not wrong side of history as viewed by conservatives, but even by their own ideological colleagues. To show you what I'm talking about, I will rely on the New York Times, a former newspaper, as Andrew Klavan likes to correctly point out. Now, in order to portray this as accurate as possible, I'll read to you passages from two different New York Times articles and one from the Washington Compost, formerly Washington Post, and not even a former newspaper. So, first article, the former newspaper published in the closing days of 2016, the article titled, "Feminism Lost, Now What?" Let's read, quote, "This was supposed to be the year of triumph for American women. A year that would cap an arc of progress. Seneca Falls, 1848, the 19th Amendment, 1920, the first female American president, 2017. An inauguration that would usher in a triumvirate of women running major Western democracies, little girls getting to see a woman in the White House. Instead, for those at the forefront of the women's movement, there is despair, division, and defiance. Hillary Clinton's loss was feminism's too. A man whose behavior toward women is a throwback to pre-feminist days is now setting the tone of the country. The cabinet that Donald J. Trump has nominated includes men and a few women with public records hostile to a range of issues at the heart of the women's movement. A majority of white women voted for him, shattering myths of female solidarity and the belief that demeaning women would make a politician unelectable. More broadly, there is a fear that women's issues, and as the movement has defined them, reproductive rights, women's health, workplace advancement, and the fight against sexual harassment, among others, could be trampled or ignored. Now, quite frankly, I wish she was right. I mean, ignoring the so-called women's issues would be a fabulous thing in and of itself, since most people, including most women, don't actually agree with them anyway. But anyway, back to the article. Quote, "The Women's March on Washington on January the 21st is an apt metaphor for the movement. Movement as primer scream. It grew out of a post on Facebook, was unconnected to any established women's organization, and has no set list of demands. Hundreds of thousands of women say they are going, but will their anger turn into a broader movement?" Now, stop right there. Now, this paragraph is literally fake news. The so-called Women's March is not a grassroots effort. It's a coordinated agitprop campaign. And everyone knows it, including the former newspaper. Now, the New York Times could have simply ignored this, but instead they chose to outright lie about it. One of the contributors to their manifesto is Kelly Robinson, which is Planned Parenthood's Deputy National Organizing Director. The list of partners include the Coalition of Nasty Women, and no, I'm not joking, the Planned Parenthood, Free the Nipple, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and it goes on and on and on. It's almost as if it's a competition on who can hate men more. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be attendees who genuinely decided to be there independently. There might be some of those, though not that many, since many cancelled, as I'll show soon enough. But that's exactly how you construct a successful agitprop campaign like this. You don't share to everyone the fact that it is an agitprop effort. Also, it is simply not true that the so-called movement has no set of demands. The so-called movement has its own website launched prior to the publication of this article and has a huge PDF there with its list of demands. Now, unsurprisingly, the demands don't differ almost at all with the Democrat platform. Free shit for everyone, degeneracy legal and free for everyone, open borders for everyone, and so on and so forth. Again, the New York Times could have simply ignored this, but instead they chose to outright lie about it. Now, please bear with me. This all ties together neatly, but only if we get into their mindset, even if for just a few minutes. So, continuing with the article, quote, "We need a come-to-Jesus moment," said C. Nicole Mason of the Center for Research and Policy in the Public Interest at the New York Women's Foundation. "I feel like the denial is very severe." In the weeks after the election, in conversations with nearly 24 advocates for women, I heard the fractures of a movement still regrouping after an unexpected defeat. They know that Mrs. Clinton didn't stand for the feminist movement directly, and that you could vote against her without saying you were voting against feminism. But one of the movement's goals was shattering the ultimate glass ceiling. Some say the failure to do so was so devastating that now is the time to rebuild from the ground up. Others insist it's time to stay the course. The challenges are a proxy for the questions the Democratic Party must face over class, race, identity politics, and tactics. The women's movement must balance how to broaden its message without losing its base. Courting the white working class could alienate black women still smarting over white women voting for a man whom many saw as racist, a choice that seemed to put racial identity over gender solidarity. Some younger women shunned the feminist label altogether. It's not clear how far the tent can stretch without leaving some outside. The overall struggle is to stay relevant in the age of Trump. Before the election, even I was stunned by the sheer number of people I knew who came forward saying they'd been survivors of sexual assault, says Vivian Labaton, co-executive director of Make It Work, which promotes working families' economic security. It's amazing to me the lightning speed at which these issues have receded. The story is the total omission of women overnight. So, they need a come-to-Jesus moment. And yet I am the extremist when I say that feminism is a cult at its best and a mental disorder in its regular days. Anyway, overall their analysis is quite correct. The left painted itself into a corner backed by an increasingly divisive and divided coalition. I mean, just think about it. At any moment, no two different factions of the coalition can survive in the same room together. The left backs Hamas, which thinks throwing off fags off the top of the roofs is just fine. So no fags and Hamas in the same room. Then there's the classical feminists who can't be in the same room with most men. And then there is the intersectional feminists who can't be in the same room with most men and most women. I could go on like this for a while, but you get the point. Their coalition simply lacks a positive idea to unite them. Now, I should say, though, that they do have a negative idea to unite them. The hatred of the West. The hatred of standards and the hatred of civilization. That's really all these factions have in common. But anyway, this article is long, so I'll include just one more excerpt which is of interest for us. So, quote, although exit polls suggest that the majority of young women voted for Mrs. Clinton, their enthusiasm for Bernie Sanders during the primary seemed to say that for some, feminism's traditional preoccupations seem out of date. In late October, when the polls indicated that Mrs. Clinton would win, I sought out young women to talk about their perceptions of her. Jessica Salons, 27, who is running for local office in Los Angeles in 2017, said she found Mrs. Clinton's feminism outdated, failing to prioritize climate change, income inequality, and the toll of American intervention overseas. Anyway, skipping a bit more. Feminism, which at its heart should mean opportunities for women in every sphere, has also come to be seen as a proxy for liberalism, alienating conservatives. S.A. Cobb, a columnist for the Daily News in New York and a conservative who did not vote for Mr. Trump, said, quote, there's a condescension that comes across from some in the women's movement. There's this idea that if you're not a liberal, you're a traitor to your gender. Is our message alienating entire groups of people, including women? Close quote. She raised the provocative possibility that many women believe that Mr. Trump would keep the country safe in part because of his paternalistic alpha male persona, and that was an implicit rejection of feminism's attempts to redefine gender roles. Others worry that the women's movement has spent too much time policing language and behavior, blaming and shaming at the expense of dialogue. That, Professor Williams argues, can make misogyny attractive to the white working class, a way to rebel against condescending elites. Now, misogyny here should be read as disagreement with feminism. Back to the article. The answer, some argue, is rebranding feminism, recasting issues in economic terms relevant to the working class, men as well as women. While the working family's agenda is very strong, it's not big enough to get the country back on its feet, said Celinda Lake, a long-time Democratic pollster. It needs to be embedded in a bigger economic message. Sometimes we talk about it in ways that make it sound like it's just for women to the exclusion of men. By contrast, she said, Mr. Trump's economic platform was clear and compelling. Mrs. Clinton's calls for equal pay, child care, paid family leave, and health insurance that covered birth control and mammograms paled before the appeal of someone who promised to bring back better-paying manufacturing jobs and restore a lost standard of living. The key is to link the two messages, to take issues that benefit women and show how they help families as a whole. Now, this is actually a very good argument, almost too good that could make the left, conceivably make the left again competitive. But not only it is too little, too late for them, but it's also unassailable because, again, the base of the left is what it is: racist, divisive, hateful, collectivist, impervious to reason, dismissive of decency, and of course, loud. Now, how bad it is? Well, the New York Times shows this in a piece published on January the 9th called Women's March on Washington Opens Contentious Dialogues About Race. You know where this is going. Of course it had to be about race. Now, although this video is getting a bit long, this all ties together, as I was saying, and it's important to hear this. So, since I read the New York Times, so you don't have to do the same thing, please listen to this quote. Many thousands of women are expected to converge on the nation's capital for the Women's March on Washington the day after Donald J. Trump's inauguration. Jennifer Willis no longer plans to be one of them. Miss Willis, a 50-year-old wedding minister from South Carolina, had looked forward to taking her daughters to the march. Then she read a post on Facebook page for the march that made her feel unwelcome because she's white. The post, written by a black activist from Brooklyn who is a march volunteer, advised white allies to listen more and talk less. It also chided those who it said were only now waking up to racism because of the election. You don't just get to join because now you're scared too. Read the post. I was born scared. Now, stung by the tone, Miss Willis cancelled her trip. This is a women's march, she said. We're supposed to be allies in equal pay, marriage, and adoption. Why is it now about white women don't understand black women? If all goes as planned, the January 21st march will be a momentous display of unity in protest of a president whose treatment of women came to dominate the campaign's final weeks. But long before the first buses roll to Washington and sister demonstrations take place in other cities, contentious conversations about race have erupted nearly every day among marchers, exhilarating some and alienating others. In Tennessee, emotions ran high when organizers changed the name of the local march from Women's March on Washington-Nashville to Power Together Tennessee in solidarity with Women's March on Washington. Whilst many applauded the name change, which was meant to signal the start of a new social justice movement in Nashville, some complained that the event had turned from a march for all women into a march for black women. In Louisiana, the first state coordinator gave up her volunteer role in part because there were no minority women in leadership positions at the time. I got a lot of flack locally when I stepped down from white women who said I'm alienating a lot of white women, said Candice Huber, a bookstore owner in New Orleans who is white. They said, why do you have to be so divisive? In some ways, the discord is by design. Even as they are working to ensure a smooth and unified march next week, the national organizers said they made a deliberate decision to highlight the plight of minority and undocumented migrant women and provoke uncomfortable discussions about race. Now, by the way, there is no such thing as undocumented immigrant women. No, there's female foreign criminals. Anyway, this really is a train wreck, and it is glorious. Now, in other words, the internal divisions amongst the revolutionaries are getting more and more clear. Now, if I were to have a way to stir up even more of that, I'll do it in a heartbeat. I know for a fact that there are a few conservatives deeply working within the left for sabotage purposes that also watch this channel. So if you can agitate more and pit the factions against each other, please do so. Anyway, just because Mr. Trump was elected and that the PC types are a bit off balance, it doesn't mean that the Democrat media complex has changed. At least not yet, anyway. Now, if they will, it will take at least 6 more months, probably even more than that. If they are to reform at all, they'll reform probably next year around January or February. So as a result, the Washington Compost wrote this on January the 12th. City parking permits for 200 buses are being sought for Inauguration Day. The number for the Women's March, 1,200. Now, it's a very short communicate, so, quote, far more parking permits are being sought for buses for the Women's March on Washington the day after inauguration than for the inauguration itself, D.C. Council member Charles Allen said Thursday. Allen, a Democrat, said organizers have applied for permits for at least 1,200 to park at the RFK Stadium in Washington on January the 21st, the day of the Women's March on Washington, whilst just 200 are being sought for parking the day before Inauguration Day. NBC4 first reported the figures. RFK has a capacity of 1,300 buses. RFK Stadium is the main city-run parking option for charter buses over that weekend. Bus drivers can still find their own parking outside RFK, so these numbers do not necessarily reflect all of the buses that will be headed to the district for inauguration or the Women's March. The D.C. Council is scheduled to hold a hearing Thursday on inauguration readiness and logistics. The district's Department of Transportation is running the parking and permitting process at RFK and says there are other parking sites in the city at locations such as the Union Station and the Navy Yard. At President Obama's 2009 inauguration, which saw record-breaking attendance numbers, more than 3,000 charter buses were registered for parking permits in the city that day. So, in other words, the media wants you to believe that not only Trump's inauguration will likely be a minuscule event compared to Obama's 2009 inauguration, but it would also be much smaller than the far left's feminist hysteria agitprop scheduled for the next day. Except that's probably not the case at all. Now, I can't know whether Trump's inauguration will be bigger than Obama's. Maybe it will be, maybe not. Quite frankly, I don't care. But what I do know is that WashPo just engaged in fake news. Again. First of all, inauguration is not exactly a one-day, one-off event. It's actually a 3-day event. From the American Bus Association, we learned that there are 2 events on January the 19th. The wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery and the Make America Great Again welcome concert and celebration at the Lincoln Memorial. Then there is the oath of office swearing-in ceremony on January the 20th at the Capitol, the inaugural parade, and then the balls and the galas. And then on January the 21st, there's the National Prayer Service at the Washington National Cathedral. All of these events are Trump-related. So a fair comparison would have to be how many buses were reserved for the 3-day period, and also an honest look to the other places that serves as gigantic parking lots for buses, because it's not just the RFK Stadium. The American Bus Association says there will be roughly 1,500 buses for the 3-day inauguration events. So either the feminists are lying or the American Bus Association is lying. My money is on the feminists lying, because the American Bus Association is not known to lie, and more importantly, they have no incentive to lie, since they work on shekels and not on feelings. Now, to tie all of these together, I'll say this. The identitarian left is in shambles and very prone to irrational behavior, much more so than in a regular period of time. Now, rather than ignoring them, it is a much better strategy to troll them and bait them into acting even more irrationally. But doesn't this seed discord and disunity, some would ask? Well, yes, it does, which is exactly the point. Unity with progressives should cease to be the goal for any normal, mentally sane, and economically literate person. Disunity with this vermin is exactly what everyone should strive for. Why? Because they're of no good to anyone. Progressives are unproductive people. They can't do any meaningful job, can't produce any coherent thought, and can't recognize reality itself even when it hits them in the face. Why bother with them anymore? Baiting them into acting as irrationally as possible and pull stunts like the ones I quoted that alienate normal everyday people, is exactly what they must be encouraged to do. Again, when the enemy is making a mistake, don't interrupt, get in and help. They're digging their holes as we speak, and they upgraded from spoons to shovels. Now I say, let's get them excavators and get over with this faster. Now I obviously mean this metaphorically. I'm not saying we should bury them literally, because that would be an environmental crime. I mean, why would you poison the soil with such vermin? Anyway, the serious point I'm trying to make is that we should try to separate even more the few smart people left, well, on the left, like those that I quoted from the former newspaper, who understand why they lose, from the rest of the left, and at the same time agitate and bait the rest of the left to fight with each other as much as possible. Why have just a few hundred white women who think that maybe this whole thing has gotten too racist and toxic and maybe should be abandoned? Why not have several million people of all races becoming actively frustrated with the left to enough levels for them to start voting against it? Basically, what I'm saying is, let's scale this whole thing up. The terrain is very, very ripe for this. That's why in 2017 I started including practical politics in almost every video. It's time to fight back on the grassroots. Basically, shun progressives wherever you see them. Make it known to anyone that progressivism is a disease and hanging out with a progressive is a moral stain on your character. They've been getting away with way too much shit for way too many years. I'd say it's time to bring some balance to the whole thing. That's all I had to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.